I'm going to welcome Elaine Johnson, Director of People for Great Places Housing Group, to today's Intuitive Knowledge session. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'll start just by giving a little bit of background of social housing for people that don't know the sector. So social housing we used to call council housing, and it's housing that's provided for people in housing need. So across the country, social housing providers house about 22% of the population, and in Greater Manchester it's slightly higher than that. As a sector, we tend to work very, very closely together. It's a very collaborative sector in that, unlike a lot of industries, we are not competing for customers. We actually have more customers than we can deal with. I'm sure you've all heard the stories about the housing lists that everybody's dealing with. There is certainly a housing crisis in this country. There are definitely more people that need safe, affordable houses than we can provide. But our role is to provide housing, and it isn't just about bricks and mortars. For most housing providers, it's actually about providing homes from which people can live successful lives. So that's what the sector does. In Greater Manchester, there are 26 separate housing providers, some of which have been transferred from local councils. Others have a history of housing that's come through churches and religious-based institutions. But we all have the same ethos. We are all here to provide safe, affordable housing for people in housing need. So going back to where Nina started the webinar today, where did Boost come from? Well, as Nina mentioned, in 2018, the CABE report was commissioned, which was looking at housing associations and looking at the leadership of housing associations. Of the 64 housing providers that took part in that survey, only 3 of them had non-white chief executives, and only 12 of them had an executive team with anybody in that exec director team that wasn't white. 3/4 of them had exclusively white executive teams, and 2 actually had an executive team which was made up entirely of white males. And actually, when you look back on the last 5 years before 2018, very, very little had changed. So if you think of that in terms of the leadership of these organisations that are providing safe, affordable homes for people in housing need, if you actually look at who those people are, who are our customers, who are the tenants and residents, what you see is that social housing tenants are disproportionately more likely to be from Black, Asian or minoritized ethnic backgrounds. In fact, 44% of Black African families in this country are social housing renters. 40% of Black Caribbean families are also social housing renters. And when you compare that to white people, we actually provide housing for only 16% of white people. So if you look at that, you can see we've got a leadership of this sector, which is predominantly white, that is providing services to a customer base that isn't. So the decision makers in the sector are working from their sort of white perspective, working from their history, their culture, their customs as white people, yet providing services and housing. Really important. If you think of what's the most important thing for most people, it is their home. It is that base from which they build their lives, they bring up their children, they make their memories. And yet the people that were making decisions were predominantly white, from white backgrounds. When we looked across Greater Manchester housing provider, of the 26 housing providers that we had, 16 of them were 90% white in their leadership teams, and actually 8 of them were exclusively white. So at that point, we decided that actually something had to change. We had to think about how we did things differently, because what we were doing was only producing white leaders that didn't reflect our customer base and didn't reflect those people that were partaking of our services. So that's when we approached Manchester University. They had previously done some work for us on looking at the barriers to females coming into leadership roles. So it seemed to us like the best place to start. So we worked with them initially on a pilot project where 13 of the Greater Manchester housing providers took part in the pilot project. And given the fact that most people that end up in leadership roles at some point in their career have been, for want of a better word, spotted, or somebody's taken an interest in their career, somebody's seen them and thought, there's somebody with a bit of talent, there's somebody that actually looks sort of bright and sparky, somebody that can actually hold people's attention and lead people. And people then have sort of extended their sponsorship to them. So that might be with some coaching, with some mentoring. It might be by selecting them for a particular project, or thinking about a secondment opportunity. But at some point, somebody's taken an interest in them and started to grow them and develop their career. Most people do that with people that look like them. They sort of see people that potentially think, oh, that was me 20 years ago, and reach out to them. And as people do that to people like them, most of those people were white people. So as part of the project and part of the pilot, we decided that we'd sort of replicate that, but we'd do it in a slightly different way. And in the pilot, we actually call this reciprocal mentoring. So we put together a white senior leader as a mentor from one housing association, with a mentee who was from an ethnically diverse background in another organisation. And the idea of that was that the white mentor would fulfil a usual mentoring role. So, help people with their career development, help them with their learning, help them with their growth, and do that normal mentoring sort of relationship. But in return, the reciprocal element of it was that the mentee would talk to the white leader about their lived experience of being somebody from an ethnically diverse background, working in housing, working in the sector, and some of the barriers that they felt they'd come across, and how that felt to live and work in that situation. And that's how we set it up. And I suppose that was the first learn, really, because when we went out to the 13 organisations, we asked them for their most senior ethnically diverse manager, with the potential to move at least one, if not two, levels further up within their organisation. And we were sort of expecting that people would come forward at sort of heads of service, senior manager level. And actually, when we actually put that call out, the people that came forward were at best first line managers. And that's where we sort of realised that actually we need to start working a lot further upstream. We didn't actually have those people at that level. Sort of ethnically minoritized people were lower down in the organisational level. So we did have to take a little bit of a step back at that. I suppose the difference in this programme between it being just a normal mentoring programme is we also put in a change champion. So each organisation had a change champion, and they were charged with bringing together in their organisation their mentor and their mentee, and having conversations about what's coming out of that relationship with their mentor and mentee. What were we learning? What were the cultural barriers to ethnically minoritized leaders coming forward and really sort of growing, progressing and thriving in our organisations? So we did the pilot, and actually what we learned from the pilot, and I suppose I intimated this when I said when we realised we were working a lot further upstream, we realised there was an awful lot of issues that we needed to resolve and unpick. One of the first ones was there wasn't any role models there for our ethnically diverse colleagues. There just weren't the role models. There weren't people there in leadership positions. They couldn't see people like themselves in those senior positions, even in middle manager positions. So there was no role models there. We also learned that we had a very white culture. And actually that was probably one of the biggest barriers. And a lot of our ethnically diverse colleagues told us that when they came into work, they couldn't be their true selves. They actually sort of had to mould themselves into our white culture. And we had very, very white cultures. The other thing that came forward is there wasn't any cultural curiosity either, that our leaders and managers were not seeking to understand from our ethnically diverse colleagues what was happening in their lives, what was happening in their backgrounds, their history, how they felt about things. And the other thing we found is that in recruitment, although we were doing things that in a textbook were all the right ways to do recruitment, and we were doing all the normal things that you do in terms of having your role descriptions and doing your assessments, your interviews. But actually what we had is recruitment based on people like me, that actually those were the people that were then being appointed into jobs. And there was very much this feeling that our ethnically diverse colleagues had to leave their lives, their culture, everything about themselves at the door and become different people when they were in work. And I suppose really, when you look at that, we then started to think about what was happening on the other side for our customers and how that was affecting our customers. Because actually, ultimately, that's what it's all about. How are we running our organisations, and are our organisations delivering the best service we could for our customers? At the time, of course, there was the Grenfell situation, and you look at that and you think of the people that died in that terrible fire, and then you look at the people that were running that housing association. They were all white. The people that ran that housing block were all white. They had no real understanding, no real empathy or even compassion for their customers in that particular block. And ultimately, we also had the situation with our Ashak in Rochdale, who was a little boy who died because his social housing provided home was damp and mouldy. And that brings me to another piece of work that was done, the Better Social Housing Review, and they were looking at social housing, and this came out of the Grenfell inquiry to say, how could we do this better? And what came out of that is that tenants from ethnically diverse backgrounds were much more likely to be living in the poorest quality homes that we provided. Those were the homes that were more likely to be damp and mouldy, that were more likely to be overcrowded and have the least access to green spaces. So pulling all that together, that was our real burning platform to say, well, actually, we've done the pilot, we've learned lots of things about our organisation and our culture and our decision making. And I have to say, I've worked in housing a long time. The people I've worked with in housing are genuinely people that are very caring about our customers. They genuinely really, really want to do the right thing by our customers. We've all got values. We all talk about fairness as part of our values. But actually, what a big, I suppose, blind spot for us has been that actually we were not genuinely understanding huge parts of our customer base. So from the pilot, that gave us that burning platform to say, we need to take this forward now. We need to learn from the pilot. And actually, rather than think about this as a mentor-mentee mentoring program, this is a massive cultural change, a massive cultural shift that we need to do in our organisations that makes them much more inclusive. And that actually, when we are making decisions, operational decisions about housing, that we have different voices, different perspectives, different backgrounds in the room that will inform our decision making and make our services far more inclusive. So from that point, we commissioned Manchester University to actually then do a 3-year programme with us, which was about implementing that cultural change in terms of how we were going to change the faces around our executive tables so that we had more black, brown faces around that table so that our decision making could be much more inclusive. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Julia, and she'll start to talk about the detail of what we actually did as we started working with Manchester University. We are now 12 months into our 3-year programme. We're still learning. There's still loads of things that are coming out of it, which are really, really insightful. And those are the things that we want to share with you so far.